Ms. Lee is recognized.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is Lee Amendment number 3.
An amendment
Read.
offered by Ms. Lee.
Consider it read. The gentlewoman's recognized for 3 minutes.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, this amendment now, earlier, I tried to address issues around the homeless, then issues around low-income families, trying to ensure they have access to affordable housing. Now, this one speaks to those living in public housing. And I just have to preface my comments by saying that, you know, we know there's a housing crisis in this country, and this Department of HUD is their perspective on affordable housing is quite frankly shocking to me. And as I listen to this debate tonight, I'm reminded of Steve Bannon talking about deconstructing the administrative state. Well, basically what this does, this budget, is really deconstructing affordable, decent housing for every American. And it's really shameful. All my amendment would do is fund by $140 million to ensure that the Public Housing Authority can effectively administer these housing vouchers on what's left of them on a timely basis. It would bring the funding back to fiscal 17 levels. So I ask for, and I vote for this amendment for those living in public housing, not the homeless, not low-income individuals who are seeking affordable housing, now for public housing.
Thank you, Ms. Lee. Chairman Diaz-Balart.
Mr. Chairman, thank you again. This amendment has no offsets, and so in addition to the money that we have here, we have report language that directs the Secretary to use existing authority to cut red tape and reduce administrative burdens on PHS, obviously wherever possible without compromising resident health and safety, exactly, or also taxpayer investments. So again, this amendment is not offset, so it would do the same thing that the other ones did. It would not allow us to go to the floor, so therefore I would urge a no vote. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Price.
Mr. Chairman, I urge a yes vote on Ms. Lee's amendment. The administrative fees to tenant-based rental assistance are cut in this bill from last year's level by $100 million. That comes on top of flat funding the year before. You simply can't administer a responsible program, an effective program, without administrative costs being covered. We need to make up for the cut in the underlying bill and allow for inflation. We need to provide funding that allow for responsible administration of the program. It's quite straightforward. I urge its adoption.
Thank you, Mr. Price. Gentlelady's recognized for a minute to close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Once again, it looks like we're trying to make sure that we can't administer what's left of these programs, which would, you know, probably end up allowing for the elimination of the programs because we don't have enough resources to effectively administer them. And I guess I would ask the chairman, if we found an offset, would you support this in my closing remarks? And I would answer that. That's rhetorical, of course, and I'd just say I bet you would not support it, even if it had an offset. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ms. Lee. I know that the chairman will always looks forward to working with you because you're bound and determined and you're passionate. The question is on the Lee amendment. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say nay. Opinion of the chair, the nays have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Sufficient hands. Clerk will call.
Mr. Adderholt. Mr. Adderholt. Mr. Aguilar. Mr. Aguilar, aye. Mr. Amadei. Mr. Amadei, no. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Calvert. Mr. Calvert, no. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Cartwright. Mr. Cartwright, aye. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark, aye. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Cuellar. Mr. Cuellar, aye. Mr. Culberson. Mr. Culberson, no. Ms. DeLauro. Ms. DeLauro, aye. Mr. Dent. Mr. Dent, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart, no. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Fleischman, no. Mr. Fortenberry. Mr. Fortenberry, no. Mr. Frelinghuysen. No. Mr. Frelinghuysen, no. Ms. Granger. Ms. Granger, no. Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves, no. Dr. Harris. Dr. Harris, no. Ms. Herrera-Butler. Ms. Herrera-Butler, no. Mr. Jenkins. Mr. Jenkins, no. Mr. Joyce. Mr. Joyce, no. Ms. Capter. Ms. Capter, aye. Mr. Kilmer. Mr. Kilmer, aye. Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee, aye. Mrs. Lowy. Mrs. Lowy, aye. Ms. McCullum. Ms. McCullum, aye. Ms. Meng. Ms. Meng, aye. Mr. Molinar. Mr. Molinar, no. Mr. Newhouse. Mr. Newhouse, no. Mr. Palazzo. Mr. Palazzo, no. Ms. Pingree.
Aye.
Ms. Pingree, aye. Mr. Pocan. Mr. Pocan, aye. Mr. Price. Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Quigley. Mr. Quigley, aye. Mrs. Roby. Mrs. Roby, no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, no. Mr. Rooney. Mr. Rooney, no. Miss Roybal Allard. Miss Roybal Allard, aye. Mr. Rupesberger. Mr. Rupesberger, aye. Mr. Ryan. Mr. Serrano. Mr. Serrano, aye. Mr. Simpson. Mr. Simpson. Mr. Simpson recorded no. Mr. Stewart. Mr. Stewart, no. Mr. Taylor. Mr. Taylor, no. Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Valadeo, no. Mr. Visklosky. Mr. Visklosky, aye. Ms. Wasserman Schultz. Ms. Wasserman Schultz, aye. Mr. Womack. Mr. Womack, no. Mr. Yoder. Mr. Yoder, no. Mr. Young. Mr. Young,
Are
no.
there any members who wish to record their vote or change their vote? If not, Mr. Adderholt's recognized. How's
Mr. Adderholt is not recorded.
Okay.
Mr. Adderholt, no.
The clerk will tally then. I don't see anyone else. On this vote, the ayes are 21, the nays are 30. The amendment's not agreed to. And the last